Hello and welcome to Unacademy. I am Rajshekhar Reddy, faculty for Current Affairs, Polity and International Relations. I have started a series called Top 200 Topics in Current Affairs for Civil Services Prelims 2020, and this lecture is part of that series. So we have already finished 10 sessions in this series. This is the 11th session of the series. Before starting today's lecture, I would like to tell something about Unacademy as well as about myself. So I am Rajshekhar Reddy, faculty for Current Affairs. I have cleared the civil service examination in the year 2014 and I am a BTech Computer Science graduate from JNTU Hyderabad. I have a total of 7 years of experience in teaching current affairs, and my experience in giving the civil services examination will be very useful for you to crack the exam at the earliest point of time. You need to download and subscribe to the Unacademy Learning app to have the best of access to the civil services coaching facilities. So it is available on the App Store as well as the Play Store. So by downloading and subscribing to the Unacademy Learning app, you get a number of advantages. So what are these advantages? The best and the most important advantage is you have daily live classes. So you have live classes on a daily basis. So in these live classes, you can chat with your educator, you can ask questions, you can engage in discussions, and you can answer polls all while the class is going on. So this is a very important component and feature of the Unacademy Learning app. So you can have live classes on a daily basis. The courses that are available on the Learning app are structured in nature, so they deal with the syllabus comprehensively. The educators frequently take live tests and quizzes, and these are very useful for your preparation for the prelims as well as the mains exam. And most importantly, you have unlimited access to content on the Unacademy platform. So you can watch any video that has been uploaded on the Unacademy platform, and you can watch them any number of times. So there is no limit whatsoever on the number of times that you can watch these videos. Further, you can also watch the recorded sessions. You need not be present during the live class. You can also watch the recorded sessions, and you can watch them at the comfort of your place and devices. Then what else do you have in Unacademy? So you have the best educators of our country teaching on the Unacademy platform. So you have Brunal Patel sir, Roman Saini, Sudarshan Gurjar, etc., who are teaching on the Unacademy platform. So we have the best coaching facilities on the Unacademy platform. Then there are different courses that are provided in the Unacademy platform. As I've told you, you need to download the app and subscribe the app. So there are a number of subscription options available. You can subscribe for 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months. The best subscription option is the 24-month subscription, which gives you a 67% discount. So you get a 67% discount by subscribing for 24 months. You will get an additional 10% discount if you use my code RRUPSC. So this is my code RRUPSC. You get an additional 10% discount by using this code. The final transaction cost will be around 57,600, and you can convert this transaction into no cost EMS. So this is also available. So you can convert this transaction into no cost EMS, which can be extended up to 24 months. So this is about the Unacademy Learning app. So the fee on the Unacademy platform is relatively cheap compared to the other online as well as offline platforms, and the coaching standards are also very high. So let us start today's lecture. So as I have told you, I have started a series called Top 200 Topics in Current Affairs for Civil Services Prelims 2020. So there will be a series of lectures, and these series include 200 topics, which I believe or I hope will be asked in the examination this year. So we have already done with 60 topics in the last 10 lectures, and this is the 11th lecture. So for all the previous lectures, so please follow me on YouTube. And if you want the PDF of these lectures, then you have to join a channel called Rajashekhara Reddy. Rajasekhara is a single word. Then we have Reddy, it's a single word, and UPSC. is a single word. So Rajasekhara Reddy UPSC. So please join this channel so you can have access to all the files of this class, of this series. Sorry. So the topics which will be dealt in today's class are as follows. So the first topic will be the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So this act was enacted in the month of February this year. Very important. Calamity says there is a discussion in the media that the central government may impose calamity cess. So what do you mean by a calamity cess? Under what provision of the Constitution of India can calamity cess be imposed? Is there any state in our country which imposes calamity cess? Then you must have come across a number of videos in news channels on Hong Kong. So we will look at what is going on in Hong Kong. Why are people protesting against the government of Hong Kong and the government of China? And we will look at the strength of the Supreme Court. So an amendment act was passed in the year 2019, increasing the number of judges. So we will look at the qualification that needs to be fulfilled by an individual to become a judge of the Supreme Court. Two union territories were merged into a single union territory in December 2019. So we will look at the merger bill. Then there is a very important committee called Monetary Policy Committee. So they have left the key rates unchanged. So we will discuss about the Monetary Policy Committee, what is the function of the Monetary Policy Committee, and various aspects related to this. And there is an office created called the Chief of Defence Staff. This is very important for your exam. So there is an index called Saral Index, and a conference of parties to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification was held in New Delhi. We will look at that, and the last topic would be Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. So Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna is regarded as the highest achievement in the field of sports in our country. So these are the 10 topics which will be dealt in today's class. So if you have any doubts, so please contact me at this number. So 76739399090. I am Rajshekhar Reddy. So you can call me at this number to clarify your doubts. So let us move on to the next first topic for today's class. So first topic is a very important topic, that is the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So in the month of February, if I am not wrong, the government of India passed the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So what is this 104th Constitutional Amendment Act? Basically, what do you mean by an amendment to the Constitution of India, and what are the procedures that are involved in amending the Constitution of India, and what are the features of this latest Constitutional Amendment? So first of all, like any other constitution, the Indian Constitution also provides for amendment in order to adjust itself to the changing conditions and needs. So like any other constitution of India, the like any other constitution in the world, just hold on. So like any other constitution in the world, the Constitution of India also provides for the procedure to amend, and this is provided to be in tune with the changing conditions. In order to be in tune with the changing conditions, the Constitution of India provides for what is called the amendment. This procedure is provided in Article 368 of the Constitution of India. So there is an article called Article 368, and this gives you the details with respect to the amendment of the Constitution of India. What does this article say? So what does this article say? So this article says that the Constitution can be amended by the Parliament, and it can be amended by means of a bill which can be introduced in either houses of the Parliament. So the Constitution can be amended by the Parliament, and it can be introduced only by means of a bill which is called a Constitutional Amendment Bill, and it can be introduced in either houses of the Parliament. Okay, so it can be introduced in the Rajya Sabha or it can be introduced in the Lok Sabha. Once introduced, it has to be passed by a special majority. This is very important. So what is the special majority that is required for the amendment bill to be passed? So the special majority that is required is not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting. So 2/3 of the members present and voting. So not less than 2/3 of the members are present and voting, and by a majority of the total membership of the house. So and by a majority of the total membership of the house. So in order for a constitutional amendment bill to be passed, there are two conditions which must be satisfied. This bill must be passed by not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting, and it is not or it is and by a majority, that is more than 50% of the total membership of the house. And if this is passed, then it is sent to the President of India, and the President of India must give his assent to the Constitutional Amendment Bill. So this is the procedure by which we amend the Constitution of India. So the Constitution of India can be amended only by means of a resolution, which is introduced in the form of a bill. It can be introduced in either house of the Parliament. After its introduction, it must be passed by not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting, and by a majority of the house. So very recently, the government has introduced what is called the 126th Constitutional Amendment Bill, and it has been passed and it became the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So this is something which you need to know. The government has recently introduced the 126th Constitutional Amendment Bill, and it has been passed and became the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So why is the number different? So 126th Constitutional Amendment Bill must become 126th Constitutional Amendment Act, but why has it become the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act? So there is a point that you need to know. The number of the Constitutional Amendment Bill indicates that the Constitution was, there was a proposal, or there have been 126 proposals in the past to amend the Constitution of India. So Constitutional Amendment Bill indicates that there have been 126 times in the past that the Constitution was there was a proposal to amend the Constitution of India, but not all these proposals were successful. So not all proposals were successful. Only some of them were successful. Some of them did not succeed. And whoever have succeeded will become the Constitutional Amendment Act. So whichever proposal has succeeded has become the Constitutional Amendment Act. So what does this number indicate? So out of the 126 attempts which have been made in the past, 104 attempts have been successful. And that is the reason why it is called the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. And the next Constitutional Amendment Bill will be numbered as 127th Constitutional Amendment Bill. If it is passed, then it is called 105th Constitutional Amendment Act, provided there is no other Constitutional Amendment Bill introduced later but passed earlier. So assume that the 128th Constitutional Amendment Bill has also been introduced, but this has been passed earlier than this bill, that is the 127th Constitutional Bill. In that case, the 128th Constitutional Bill becomes 105th Constitutional Amendment Act. So this is a point, a very small point, but very important for your examination that you need to remember. So the bill number need not be the act number. The bill number indicates the number of proposals that have been made till date to amend the Constitution of India, and the act number indicates that the Constitution of India has been amended so many number of times. So let us see here. So like any other written constitution in the world, the Constitution of India provides for its amendment in order to adjust itself according to the changing conditions and needs. Article 368 of the Constitution provides for the procedure to amend the Constitution of India. It empowers the Parliament to amend the Constitution of India. Can any provision of the Constitution of India be amended? So this question was dealt by the Supreme Court in a number of cases. Finally, in the Keshavananda Bharati case, the Supreme Court stated that the Parliament does not enjoy the power to amend all features of the Constitution of India. So though the power of amendment is vested in the Parliament, it is not absolute, and it is subject to certain limitations, and these limitations are termed as what is called basic structure of the Constitution of India. So the Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution of India, but it should not disturb the basic structure. So what do you mean by the basic structure? But this has not been defined by the Supreme Court. So this has not been defined by the Supreme Court. But in a number of judgments which were delivered subsequently, the Supreme Court has given an indication as to what constitutes the basic structure. For example, parliamentary form of government constitutes the basic structure. Similarly, federal form of government constitutes basic structure. Then judicial independence constitutes basic structure. Then judicial review constitutes basic structure. So they have included a number of provisions which form part of the basic structure in a number of subsequent judgments, but they have not yet defined what is meant by basic structure. So the constitution can be amended by the parliament, but parliament does not enjoy immense powers to amend any part of the constitution of India. Uh, this power is restricted by the judiciary in the Keshwananda Bharati case, and the parliament can amend any part, but it should not disturb the basic structure of the constitution of India. So an amendment, as I've told you, can be introduced only can be initiated only in the form of a bill, which can be introduced in either house of the parliament, and it should be passed by both houses with a special majority. And if one house says yes, and the other house says no, then there exists a deadlock. And if there is a deadlock, there is no way that a deadlock can be removed by means of a joint session. So the constitutional amendment bill cannot be passed by means of a joint session. This is one very important point that you need to remember. Both houses must pass the constitutional amendment bill separately. There is no provision for a joint sitting to pass the constitutional amendment bills. And when passed, it will be forwarded to the president, who shall give his assent. So this is the normal procedure. Most provisions of the Constitution of India are amended by the Parliament alone. But there are some provisions of the Constitution of India which should be which should be approved by the states also. So the states also must give their approval for amending certain provisions of the Constitution of India. So the provisions which require the approval of states are usually federal in nature. So those which affect the federal structure of the Constitution of India must be approved by the states also. So in that case, the parliament must pass the constitutional amendment bill by means of a special majority, and 50% of the states, at least 50% of the states, must pass the constitutional amendment bill by means of a simple majority. Simple majority is more than 50% of the members present and voting. So those provisions which deal with the federal structure of the Constitution of India can be amended only with the approval of the states. So Parliament must pass that amendment bill by means of a special majority, and later the states have to approve by means of a simple majority. For example, the provisions that are included for amending the Constitution of India, which requires the approval of the states, are, for example, President, Vice President, the Supreme Court, that is appointment of the judges, Supreme Court. Then we have Schedule 7 of the Constitution of India, which has the 3 lists. So there are some provisions which require the approval of the states. I have written the provisions that require the approval of the states here. So the provisions which require the approval of the states are Article 54, dealing with the President of India. 55 also deals with the President of India. 73 deals with the President of India. Then we have 162, 241 deals with Union Territories. 279A deals with GST. 162 deals with the provision of the government. Then there are a number of other provisions like Chapter 4 Part 5, Chapter 5 Part 6, and Chapter 1 Part 11. So these also require the approval of the states for amending. Then we have any list in the 7th schedule. So the 7th schedule cannot be disturbed by Parliament alone. Then the representation of states in the Parliament can be changed only by means of an amendment to the Constitution of India. And Article 368 itself can be changed with the approval of the states. So the amending procedure of the Constitution itself can be changed with the approval of the states. So this is very important. So the provisions which require the approval of the states are mentioned in Article 368 itself. So there are Article 54, 55, 73. So please go through these articles. So 54, 55, 73, 162, 241, 279A, Chapter 4 of Part 5, Chapter 5 of Part 6, Chapter 1 of Part 11, then any list in the 7th schedule, then the representation of states in the parliament, and the provision of this article, that is Article 368. So the amendment shall also require to be ratified by legislatures of not less than one half of the states by resolutions to that effect passed by those legislatures before the bill making provision for such amendment is presented to the president for assent. So it must be passed by the parliament first, then it will be sent to the states, and after receiving the approval from at least 50% of the states, it will be sent to the president of India for his assent. For example, the latest bill which actually followed this provision is the 101st Constitutional Amendment Act. So this was initially passed by the parliament, and it was later passed by more than 50% of the states. So that is how GST was introduced. It replaced most of the indirect taxes that were prevalent in our country. Since the GST disturbs the federal taxation structure that is prevalent in our country, it had to be amended by means of a special procedure which is mentioned in 368. So this is the procedure by which the constitution is amended. So I have already told you that the 126th Constitutional Amendment Bill has become the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So what does this do? So what is the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act? So the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act extends the benefit, so this is very important, extends the benefit of reservation for ST as well as ST communities in Lok Sabha as well as state legislative assemblies for a period of 10 more years. So this is the essence of the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act extends the benefit of reservation that has been provided for SCs and STs in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies. So Lok Sabha has a specified percentage of seats reserved for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Similarly, every state assembly has some seats reserved for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. So this was supposed to expire on January 25th, 2021. So sorry, January 25th, 2020. So it was passed before this itself. So January 25, 2020 was the last day of this particular provision. So it was extended for 10 more years. So it has been extended for 10 more years. Now it will be, so the reservations in state legislative assembly and Lok Sabha will be applicable till January 25, 2030. So what are the articles that have been amended by the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act? So this is for your understanding that I am giving you these articles. So I think you have understood this. So the benefit of reservation provided to SCs and STs in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies have been extended. And most importantly, this amendment has also discontinued. It has discontinued the representation of the Anglo-Indian community in the state legislative assemblies and the Lok Sabha. So along with the reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the constitution also provided for the representation of the Anglo-Indian community in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies. For example, in the Lok Sabha, we have 2 members of the Anglo-Indian community nominated by the President of India. Why is this benefit extended to the Anglo-Indian community? So this benefit has been extended because the Anglo-Indian community is distributed throughout the country, and they cannot influence the outcome in any of the Lok Sabha constituencies or the assembly constituencies, and that is the reason why they have extended this benefit to the Anglo-Indian community. So since the Anglo-Indian community is sparsely distributed all over the country, they cannot influence the outcome in any of the Lok Sabha or state assembly constituencies, and that is the reason why this benefit has been extended to the Anglo-Indian community. But now, I mean, it was initially extended for 10 years and it was extended for 10 more years. So it was extended for 10 years. Before the expiry itself, it was extended for 10 more years. So similar to the extension of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reservation, we have also extended the representation of, that is the special representation of the Anglo-Indian community. But this has been discontinued from January 25th, 2020. So henceforth there will be no nomination of the Anglo-Indian community people in the Lok Sabha as well as the state legislative assemblies. So this is a very very important point. It he created some controversy, but you must remember that henceforth the strength of the Lok Sabha will be 543. It is not 545. So from the next Lok Sabha onwards, we have the strength of the Lok Sabha as 543. Two members of the Anglo-Indian community are not nominated to the Lok Sabha because this facility has been discontinued. So, but what are these articles which you need to know? So, as I've told you, so these are the articles that you need to know. So, Article 330 of the Constitution of India extends the benefit of reservation to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Lok Sabha. So, it extends the benefit of reservation to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Lok Sabha. The percentage of seats that are reserved for SC and ST in the Lok Sabha is determined by the population of SC and STs. That is something which you need to know. The number of seats reserved in any state or union territory for such castes and tribes will be made on the population basis. Then 330 deals with the SC/ST representation in the Lok Sabha. 332 deals with the SC/ST representation in the state legislative assemblies. The State Legislative Council does not have the special representation of the Anglo-Indian community. Similarly, Rajya Sabha also does not have. So these are the two articles which actually provided for reservation and it has been extended. Then for the Anglo-Indian community, we had two articles. 331 provides for representation of Anglo-Indian community in the Lok Sabha and 333 provides representation for Anglo-Indian community in the state legislative assemblies. And this principle has been discontinued now. So Article 331 of the Constitution says, notwithstanding anything in Article 81, the President may, if he is of opinion that the Anglo-Indian community is not adequately represented in the House of the People, nominate not more than two members of that community to the House of the People. So that is where we have this provision of two members of the Anglo-Indian community getting nominated to the Lok Sabha. Article 333 says the same thing about the governor. Governor can nominate not more than one person to the assembly. However, not all assemblies have this provision of nomination of the Anglo-Indian community members. I think 13 or 14. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So 13 state legislative assemblies have this provision. So Andhra Pradesh. So this is something which is important. Not all state legislative assemblies has the provision of representation to the Anglo-Indian community. Only some states have that. So what are those states? So Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Kerala, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and West Bengal. So this is the these are the states which actually enjoy or give the benefit to the Anglo-Indian community members. So recently, this has been done by the 140 done away by the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. So Article 334. So we have heard about 330 and 332, which gives SC/ST representation to SC/ST in Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies. Then we have 331 and 333, which give representation to the Anglo-Indian community in the state legislative assemblies. And this facility of reservation was initially extended only for 10 years, and this is mentioned in Article 334. So the benefit of reservation to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and the special representation to the Anglo-Indian community shall cease after 10 years. So this is very important. So you have to remember this. Shall cease to have any effect after 10 years. So, but before that period itself, the constitution was amended several times in the past, and the benefit was extended for 10 more years. So you can see here, Constitution Amendment Act extended it for 10 years, 23 extended it for 10 more years, 45 extended for 10 more years, 62, 79 and 95. So these are the Constitutional Amendment Acts which have extended the benefit of reservations for SC/ST as well as Anglo-Indian community. Now to this we have to add one more Constitutional Amendment Act, that is 104. So, but 104 has extended the benefit only for SC/ST but not to Anglo-Indian community. So this is a very important point which you need to remember. So I have written the various features of the Constitutional Amendment Bill. So please go through this. So this is about the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act, a very important and potential question for this Civil Services Prelims 2020. Then we will move on to the next topic. So this topic is called calamity cess. So what do you mean by calamity cess? And what are the various features of calamity cess? So first of all, cess is a type of tax. So it is like a tax on tax, which is collected for a specific purpose. So amount of money collected in this form of tax is collected for a specific purpose. So it is a tax on tax which is collected for a specific purpose, and the money collected must be used only on that purpose. So only on that purpose. For example, many people are familiar with this cess that is called the Swachh Bharat cess. So Swachh Bharat cess that is collected by the government must be spent only on the Swachh Bharat program. That is Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. So this is one thing which you need to know. So cess is a form of tax. It is tax on tax that is collected by the government if it has a shortfall in the revenue, and it is spent only on a specific purpose. So we have the education cess, also clean energy cess, etc., etc. So last year, Kerala became the first state in our country to impose what is called the calamity cess. As you all know, Kerala was devastated by floods in the year 2018, and it has caused a destruction which is said to be approximately 19,500 crores. According to the government of Kerala, the amount of devastation that has been caused, or the financial value of the devastation that has been caused, is approximately 19,500 crores. The central government may help Kerala by extending some financial benefit, but they cannot give the entire amount, entire loss, economic loss suffered by Kerala. So they have given some 1,000 crores for Kerala. So, but that is not sufficient, and uh, they need more resources to rebuild the flood affected areas. So in that process, Kerala has approached what is called the GST Council. So Kerala by itself they cannot impose what is called calamity cess. So calamity cess or flood relief cess is cess that is collected, and this is used only for the reconstruction of flood affected areas. So there is a specific purpose. So this can be used only for the reconstruction of flood affected areas. Okay. So Kerala by itself cannot impose this GST, this tax on GST. So they have to approach and get the approval from the GST Council. So they had to get the permission from the GST Council. So they got the permission from GST Council, and GST Council has given permission to Kerala to impose calamity cess for 2 years, and the percentage of calamity cess is 1%. So they can impose an additional 1% on goods that are sold in Kerala, and this is 1%. So let us see here. So there was a lot of discussion in the national media that the central government, so because of COVID-19, there has been a significant fall in the revenue of the central government. So the central government has seen a significant fall in the revenue collection, and the central government was actually thinking of introducing a calamity cess. So there was a proposal to introduce calamity cess for a brief period to bridge the gap between expenditure and revenue. But this proposal met with severe criticism from the general public as well as from the economists, because the common man itself is in a very precarious position. He is in a difficult financial situation, and in this situation, he cannot be charged more in the form of calamity cess. So, central government did not impose any calamity cess, but you need to know that there is a provision in the Constitution of India, that is 279 4F, I think 4AF. This is the provision, yeah, section 4F. So it's 279A, sorry, it is 279A, section 4, clause F. So Article 279A, section 4, clause F provides for calamity cess. So let me quickly go through what I have written here. A year after the worst floods in almost a century. So these are said to be the worst floods in 100 years. So a year after the worst floods in almost a century, Kerala became the first state to impose an additional cess. starting August 1st. So this was introduced on August 1st, 2019. So this is very important. So for the civil services prelims examination, you must follow the important developments of the year 2019, especially from July, August 2019, and you'll have to follow those developments till the month of May. But since the exam has been postponed till October, you need to follow the developments till the month of September. So from July 2019 to August or September 2020. So these are the developments that you need to follow as far as current affairs is concerned. So starting August 1st, 2019, for 2 years, Kerala will be implementing 1% flood cess or calamity cess apart from GST with the aim of generating additional funds for rebuilding the state. So this 1% flood cess or the calamity cess has been imposed for generating additional funds for rebuilding the state. More than 300 people have died and more than 3 lakh became homeless in the floods that raged for more than 10 days. The state government estimated that floods caused losses to the tune of 19,500 crores. So, what are the items that have been brought under the purview of the calamity cess? So, they have restricted the number of items that fall under this cess. So, what are the items that fall under this cess are mentioned here. So, essential households which are not under the purview of GST, like rice, salt, and vegetables, do not fall under the purview of the calamity cess. So, essential items are not under the purview of calamity cess. Then fuels like petrol, diesel, or even items which fall under 5% GST tax bracket like cooking oil or medicines will not be included for flood cess. So they have implemented this particular flood cess for all those items which have a tax slab of 12% or more. So as of now, we have, I think, five slabs: so zero GST, 5% GST, 12% GST, 18% GST, and 28% GST. So on products where there is no GST, there will be no calamity cess. Similarly, on products where there is 5% GST, there will be no calamity cess. But those products on which the GST is 12%, 18%, and 28%, they will attract an additional 1% calamity cess from the state of Kerala. So the Kerala government aims to collect as many as 700 crores. So the Kerala government expects to collect 700 crores in 1 year. So for 2 years, they are expecting to collect 1400 crores. Okay. So you must remember that the Kerala is the only state. So Kerala, as on today, is the only state to have imposed the calamity cess, and this has been done under section Article 279A, Section 4, Clause F. So this is a very important article. Article 279A in itself deals with GST, Goods and Services Tax, GST Council, its functions, etc. So this is a very important article. So please go through this article, Article 279A. Very important for your exams. I think we have discussed about GST Council in the last lecture. So please follow lecture number 10 for getting additional information on 279A. So this is about the calamity cess. So cess is a tax on tax which is imposed for a brief period. The purpose is to fill the shortfall that arises in between revenue and expenditure. The amount that is collected should be used only for that specific purpose. In this case, this is that is calamity cess that has been imposed by the state of Kerala will be used for the reconstruction efforts. Then there is a very important topic that is in the news. So this is with respect to Hong Kong. What is going on in Hong Kong? What are the various developments that have taken place over the past 1 year in Hong Kong? And what is the new security law which has been enacted by China with respect to Hong Kong? So this is a very important topic for your prelims examination. There is a slight chance that it can be also asked in the mains examination, but highly unlikely, but it can be asked in the prelims examination. First of all, you must know where Hong Kong is located. To which country does it belong? Is it an independent country or does it belong to any specific country? And what are the protests that are going on? So first, Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China. So it is a special administrative region of China. So it is not an independent nation. It is part of China. It served as a British colony. So it functioned as a British colony for nearly 150 years, and it was returned to China in 1997. So it was returned on July 1st, 1997. So it has been 23 years that it has been returned to China. But before the return of Hong Kong to China by the British, they have got some promises from the Chinese that Hong Kong will have its own constitution. It will have its own what is called mini constitution, which is called the Basic Law. And this Basic Law is based on a principle called one country, two systems. So this is very important for your examination. So what do you mean by one country, two systems? Or one country, two systems principle is often heard in the news with respect to which of the following territories. So one country, two systems is often heard in the news with respect to Hong Kong. So let me read what I have written here. So on July 1st, or in July 1997, as the flag of United Kingdom was lowered over Hong Kong, the prosperous colony was returned to China after 150 years of British rule. So on July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong was returned back to China by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has held Hong Kong for more than 150 years, as I have already told you. So the United Kingdom has held Hong Kong as a colony since 1841, when it occupied the area during the First Opium War. So the First Opium War was fought between China and the British Empire, and this was fought because China wanted to stop the illegal opium trade that is carried out by the British, and this has resulted in widespread addiction of opium in China. So the war broke out after Qing Dynasty or Qing Dynasty attempted to crack down an illegal opium trade that led to widespread addiction in China. Defeat, however, came at a very high cost. So in this opium war, so it happened between, I think, if I'm not wrong, it started in 1839, it ended in 1842. And in this war, China was defeated, and China had to give away Hong Kong Island permanently to the British. So Hong Kong Island was given permanently to the British under what is called the Treaty of Nanjing. So this is important. So under the Treaty of Nanjing, following the First Opium War. So you must remember that Hong Kong Island was given to the British permanently by the Chinese after the First Opium War. So you must know where Hong Kong is. So Hong Kong is a very tiny island which is located in the southern part of China. It is a special administrative region of China. And within Hong Kong there are three territories. So this is very, very important. Many people don't know this. So Hong Kong is comprised of three components. Hong Kong Island. So one is Hong Kong Island. Hong Kong Island is just a small component of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong Island, then there is one more territory called Kowloon Peninsula. And the third is New Territories. These new territories are the outlying regions of these two regions, and they account for nearly 86% of the total area of what is Hong Kong today. So what we call Hong Kong today is not just the Hong Kong Island. It is not the Hong Kong Island. It is Hong Kong Island plus Kowloon Peninsula plus the New Territories. You must remember that after the First Opium War, only the Hong Kong Island was given in perpetuity, that is permanently, to the British by the Chinese. So they did not acquire new territories or Kowloon Peninsula in 1842. They could get control over the Hong Kong Island after the conclusion of the First Opium War. But later they could get control of the other parts. So over the next half century, so over the next 50 years, starting 1842, the United Kingdom gained control over all the three main regions of Hong Kong. So over the next 50 years, they started getting control over the remaining regions of Hong Kong. So these regions included Hong Kong Island. So they have already got control over the Hong Kong Island. Then we have Kowloon Peninsula. I have mentioned it here. So this is the Kowloon Peninsula. And the New Territories. And finally the New Territories, a swath of land that comprises the bulk of Hong Kong today. So bulk of Hong Kong today is comprised of the New Territories. You can see here the New Territories and outlying islands account for nearly 86% of the total area of Hong Kong as we call it today. And these new territories were given to the British by the Chinese under a particular treaty. So this is a very important treaty. So it was given to the British by a treaty. The final treaty, that is the 1898 Convention for the extension of the Hong Kong territory. So 1898 Convention for the extension of the Hong Kong territory leased the new territories to Britain for 99 years. Under the terms of the treaty, China would regain control of the leased lands on July 1st, 1997. So these territories were not given permanently by the Chinese to the British. They were given only for the new territories. This is what I am talking about. Hong Kong was given in perpetuity. Hong Kong Island was given in perpetuity, but the new territories were given only for 99 years. But the new territories account for nearly 86% of the territory of Hong Kong as we call it today, and they had to be handed over back to Chinese on July 1st, 1997. You must know the story later. So, British Hong Kong trajectory. How did Hong Kong develop and how did China develop? So, Britain's Hong Kong trajectory. So, Hong Kong was a colony of the British. So, British Hong Kong's trajectory was different from that of mainland China, which became a communist country in 1949. As you all know, Hong Kong adopted a capitalist model of development. It was a vibrant democracy, though was a British colony, and it adopted a different model of development, and China adopted a different model of development. In fact, China became a communist nation in 1949, and when it became a communist nation in 1949, at least 1 lakh people have found refuge. So they left China and they have found refuge in Hong Kong. Capitalist Hong Kong soon experienced an economic boom, becoming home to a multicultural international community. So very soon Hong Kong became one of the most famous financial centers in the world, one of the most developed regions of the world. As the treaty's expiration, loomed, so as this year 1997 July 1st approached, there was a lot of tension among the residents of Hong Kong. So whether it will be given back to China or whether Britain will retain it or not. So as the treaty's expiration loomed, separation of new territories from the rest of Hong Kong became increasingly unthinkable. Whether the British will give back the new territories and keep the Hong Kong island. So there were a lot of questions that are raised, and separating new territories was from the Hong Kong island was unthinkable for most residents of Hong Kong, and negotiations were started between UK and China to discuss the future of Hong Kong. So negotiations started in late 1970s to discuss the future of Hong Kong, and finally, in 1984, China and Britain or the United Kingdom signed what is called the Sino-British Joint Declaration. So the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984, and this gave rise to a principle called one country, two systems. One country, two systems. So according to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, UK has agreed to give China Hong Kong, but China has also agreed to give some political and social autonomy to Hong Kong for a period of 50 years. So one country, two systems principle was not a permanent feature of Hong Kong. It was to be applicable only for 50 years. So it was handed over in 1997. So for 50 years, this principle was applicable. So it was applicable only till 2047. So one country, two systems policy was adopted in the year 1997 under what was called the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. So after the handover, so after the British handed over Hong Kong to China, Hong Kong became a special administrative region of China with its own mini constitution. As I have already told you, Hong Kong has its own mini constitution. It has got its own legal system and some democratic rights like free speech and the freedom of assembly under the Basic Law. So the fundamental law of Hong Kong, this is also termed as the Constitution of Hong Kong, that is called the Basic Law. So under the Basic Law, residents of Hong Kong enjoyed certain freedoms which are not available to the rest of China. But they could not, however, elect their own leader. This leader can be elected by the people of Hong Kong after being vetted by China. So though they did not have a full democracy, they enjoyed some kind of a democracy under what is called the Basic Law. However, since 1997, the relations between Hong Kong and China have not been smooth. China frequently wanted to interfere in the affairs of Hong Kong. So, internal affairs of Hong Kong are constantly being interfered with by China. So, starting 2014, so the matters came to head in 2014. So starting in 2014, elections were conducted using a list of candidates vetted by Beijing. That and other Chinese policies like recent attempts to allow extradition to mainland have led to mass protests, strained British-Chinese diplomatic relations, and fueled increasing concerns that China is stifling public dissent, interfering in local politics, and eroding human rights in Hong Kong. So the developments since 2014 give a clear indication that China is trying to control Hong Kong. China is trying to stifle public dissent in Hong Kong, interfere in local politics, and erode human rights prevalent in Hong Kong. Then, what is this latest development? So, as I have told you, since 1997, China has been trying to erode the human rights that are available to Hong Kong. Last year, Hong Kong enacted a particular law called the extradition law, and this law provided for extradition of people wanted by China to China. So, Hong Kong can extradite criminals or the so called criminals to China. Many people in Hong Kong feared that political prisoners will also be extradited. So, whoever opposes the Chinese rule will also be extradited to China, where they will be administered under the Chinese laws and the Chinese justice. So many people started serious protests against the extradition law, and finally the government of Hong Kong withdrew this law. So they have decided to withdraw that particular law. However, since then, that is not the end of the matter. So China again sought a new security law for Hong Kong. But this time, instead of Hong Kong enacting a law, it is China which has actually enacted a law for Hong Kong. How is it possible for China to enact a law for Hong Kong? We will be discussing that in a short while. But you must know that China has passed a security law for Hong Kong, and this has created a huge controversy. So China has passed a wide-ranging new security law for Hong Kong, which makes it easier to punish protesters and reduces the city's autonomy. So it makes it easier to punish protesters and reduces the city's autonomy. Critics have called this as the end of Hong Kong. What is this law all about? What is this law? What is this law actually? So first of all, under the basic law, so Hong Kong was supposed to have its own security law. So Hong Kong was supposed to enact its own security law under Article 23 of the basic law. But this proposal itself was so unpopular among the residents of Hong Kong that no security law was enacted till date. So till date, for the past 23 years, they have not enacted a security law because it was so unpopular among the residents of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was always meant to have a security law but could never pass one because it was so unpopular. So this is about China stepping in to ensure the city has a legal framework to deal with what it sees a serious challenge to authority. So since Hong Kong has failed to enact a law, that is the security law, it has been taken up. The task has been taken up by China to provide a legal framework to deal with what China considers is a serious challenge to its authority. Interestingly, the law was discussed in the Chinese parliament, but the details of the law were not revealed to the general public. They were revealed only after it was passed. What does this law say? So this law has some very, very controversial features. So it criminalizes any act of secession. Secession means breaking away from the country. So this is a criminal offense in any part of the world. So it criminalizes secession, subversion, that is undermining the power or authority of the central government, terrorism, violence or intimidation against people, and collusion with foreign or external forces. So this act criminalizes secession, subversion, terrorism and collusion. And the punishment for these crimes is life imprisonment. So this punishment that has been prescribed under the security law is life imprisonment. So this law came into effect on June 30th at 11 p.m., one day or 1 hour before the 23rd anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong to China from the British. It gives Beijing powers to shape life in Hong Kong it has never had before. Critics say it effectively curtails protests and freedom of speech. So any protest in Hong Kong can be construed as subversion or secession or terrorism. and they can be imprisoned for life. The new law's key provisions include. So, what are these provisions of the new law? So, crimes of secession. At this point, we have already discussed. So, crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces are punishable by a maximum sentence of life in prison. Damaging public transport facilities can be termed as terrorism. So, this is something very unfortunate. So, damaging public transport facilities are treated as terrorist activities. Those found guilty cannot stand for public office. So, those human rights activists who are fighting for the rights of the residents of Hong Kong cannot stand for public office if they are convicted. Companies will be fined or their operations in their Hong Kong will be stopped if they are found guilty. Beijing, most importantly, Beijing will have its own security office in Hong Kong, and it will also have its own law enforcement personnel. So Beijing's or Chinese police will be deployed in Hong Kong for the enforcement of the new security law. The office can send some cases to be tried in mainland China, but Beijing said it will only have that power over a tiny number of cases. Beijing said that some cases will be sent back to China, but the number of cases will be tiny, so we'll have to wait whether China follows this statement or not. Some trials will be heard behind doors. People suspected of breaking the law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. So those who are suspected of breaking the law can be wiretapped and they can be put under surveillance. Management of foreign NGOs and news agencies will be strengthened. So there will be curtains raised on media, curtains imposed, sorry. Then the law will also apply to non-permanent residents and people from outside Hong Kong who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong. So this will not just be applicable for the residents of Hong Kong, but also for the non-permanent residents of Hong Kong. How can China do this? So this is a basic question. So Hong Kong was supposed to have its own security law, but how did China do this? So there is a provision in the basic law. So in the basic law, there is an annexure called Annex 3. So there is an annexure called Annex 3. This annexure included the laws of China. So the Chinese laws that have been included in Annex 3 can be applicable to Hong Kong. So the laws enacted by China and placed in Annex 3 are enforceable in Hong Kong. Till date, the laws that have been placed in Annex 3 are non-controversial laws. Most of them deal with defense and foreign affairs. So they are not controversial. Most residents of Hong Kong were also not complaining about Annex 3. But this time they have enacted the security law and they have placed it in Annex 3. So instead of following the normal procedure, they have actually adopted something which is technically possible. So under the agreement, Hong Kong had to enact its own security law. This was set out in Article 23 of the Basic Law, but it never happened because of its unpopularity. Then last year, protests over an extradition law turned violent and evoked into a broader anti-China and pro-democracy movement. China does not want to see that happen again. So how did it happen? So many might ask how China can do this if the city was supposed to have freedoms guaranteed under the handover agreement. The basic law says Chinese laws can't be applied in Hong Kong unless they are listed in a section called Annex 3. There are already a few listed there, mostly uncontroversial and around foreign policy. So the basic law says, so this is very important. So the basic law says Chinese laws can't be applied in Hong Kong unless they are listed in a section called Annex 3. There are already a few listed there, mostly uncontroversial and around foreign policy. However, this law, that is the security law, has been introduced by decree. They have introduced it by order against the wishes of the people of Hong Kong. They have by force added this security law into Annex 3, and that is the reason why people are not happy with what China has done. Many countries are also not happy, and this dilutes what is called the principle of one country, two systems. Several countries have reacted. So Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong. So some countries have suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong, while UK offered citizenship options to Hong Kong residents. UK has gone ahead and offered citizenship options to Hong Kong residents. Critics say the law makes it easier to punish protesters and critics of the Chinese government. Hong Kong government says that the law is required to bring order to a city that saw mass pro-democracy protests last year that often turned violent. So while the critics say that this is a dilution of the one country two systems principle, Hong Kong government says that this is essential and needed in order to bring peace and stability to the city state of Hong Kong. Okay, let us continue with the class. Let us move on to the next topic. So the next topic is Supreme Court judges. So very recently, I mean that is in 2019, the Parliament has taken a very important decision to increase the strength of the Supreme Court. In this context, we must know the current strength of the Supreme Court and the procedure that is prevalent to appoint decide on the strength of the Supreme Court. So you must remember that it is the Parliament which enjoys the power to decide the strength of the Supreme Court, and it is not the President of India. So it is not the President, and it is the Parliament which decides the strength of the Supreme Court, and they can do so by means of an act. So they have to pass an act, and this act will determine the strength of the Supreme Court. So the Parliament in August 2019 has passed an amendment bill. So the Supreme Court number of judges amendment bill was passed by Parliament in August 2019. After the law came into force, the sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court is 33, besides the Chief Justice of India. So the strength of the Supreme Court as of now is Chief Justice of India plus 33 judges. So the total strength of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice of India, is 34. So you may be asked this question, including the Chief Justice of India, it is 34. Excluding the Chief Justice of India, it is 33. Earlier, the strength of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice of India, was 31. So there has been an approximately 10% increase in the strength of the Supreme Court. The move to increase the strength of the judges by 3 or 10% comes against the backdrop of rising number of cases in the top court, which stand at nearly 60,000. So as you all know, a major problem with Indian judiciary is the very large number of pending cases. So there are lakhs and lakhs of cases that are pending in the high courts and the lower courts. Even at the Supreme Court, we have 60,000 cases pending. So this move to increase the number of judges is done in the backdrop of the rising number of cases. The Supreme Court Number of Judges Act 1956. So the first time that the Supreme Court has enacted a law to fix the strength of the Supreme Court. The Constitution, when it entered into force, has an article called 124. In this article, the number of judges was fixed at 8, that is 7 judges plus 1 Chief Justice of India, that is 8. This was changed subsequently by this act called the Supreme Court Number of Judges Act 1956. The Supreme Court Number of Judges Act 1956 was last amended in 2009 to increase the strength of the judges from 25 to 30. So it was increased from 25 to 30, excluding the Chief Justice of India in 2009. Now again it has been amended and it has decided, it has increased the strength of the Supreme Court to 34. So this is a small topic which you need to know. The current strength of the Supreme Court is 34 and the power to decide on the strength of the Supreme Court is vested in the Parliament. Then in the early years, the judges of the Supreme Court sat together and heard all the cases before them. But as the work of the Supreme Court increased, they began to work in the form of benches. They created small benches to deal with various types of cases. So as I've told you, initially the strength of the Supreme Court was 8. It was increased to 11 in 1956, 14 in 1960, 18 in 1978, 26 in 1986, and 31 in 2009. Okay, so this is just a small topic for your understanding. So what are the qualifications that are needed to be fulfilled for a person to be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court? This is very important for your exam. So in order to become a judge of the Supreme Court, a person must be a citizen of India. So first and the foremost qualification that he should fulfill is that he must be a citizen of India. And he must have for at least 5 years. So he should have been a judge of the High Court for at least 5 years. So 5 years as a judge of the High Court. It may not be a single High Court, but 2 or more High Courts. So he must have been a judge of the High Court for 5 years, or he should have been an advocate of a High Court or 2 or more such courts in succession for at least 10 years. So he should have been an advocate of a High Court for at least 10 years, or he may be a distinguished jurist in the opinion of the President of India. So if he is a distinguished jurist in the opinion of the President of India, then he can be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court. So, in order to be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court, a person must be a citizen of India and must have for at least 5 years a judge of the High Court or of a High Court or of two or more such courts in succession, or an advocate of the High Court or of two or more such courts in succession for at least 10 years. Or he must be, in the opinion of the President of India, a distinguished jurist. So, this is a small thing which I wanted to tell you. Then we will move on to another bill that has been passed by the parliament. So this is a very important topic for your examination. Bills passed by the parliament. So there are three sessions held every year in the parliament. So they are the budget session, monsoon session, and the winter session. So I request you to please follow the bills that have been passed in all these three sessions for the years 2019 and 20. So questions have been asked in the past and they will be asked this year also. So please go through this very important topic. Bills that have been passed in the parliament last year and this year. So very recently, the government of India has taken a decision to merge two union territories. This merger was done under a specific bill, and we will look at that merger. So the union territories of Daman and Diu and Dadra and Nagar Haveli became a single union territory on January 25th, 2000, January 26, 2020. So on the Republic Day, the two union territories were merged into a single union territory. The Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu merger of union territories bill was passed by Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha in the winter session of the parliament in 2019. So this decision to merge was done or taken by the union cabinet. It was approved by the parliament. So the merged union territory will be called Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu. So it is a lengthy name that has been given. So Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu is the name of the newly merged union territory. So DNDD. So the merger of the two union territories located along the west coast near Gujarat is being done for better administration. So this is done for better administration and to check duplication of various works. So these are the reasons that are cited by the government of India. So for better administration and to check duplication of various works, the merger of union territories has taken place. So far, both the union territories have different budgets, different secretariats, even though they are just 35 kilometers apart. Dadra and Nagar Haveli had one district, as just one district, while Daman and Diu has two districts. Both the union territories were under Portuguese rule, so you have to remember this point. So both the union territories, that is Daman and Diu and Dadra and Nagar Haveli, were under Portuguese rule for a long time and were liberated in December 1961. So they were liberated from the Portuguese rule in 1961. So from 1961 to 1987, Daman and Diu was part of the Union Territory of Goa. And in 1987, when Goa got statehood, Daman and Diu was made a separate Union Territory. So this is one thing which is important. Daman and Diu became a separate Union Territory in 1987 after Goa was made a state. Dadra and Nagar Haveli was occupied by the Portuguese in 1783. Residents of Dadra and Nagar Haveli got themselves liberated from the Portuguese rule in 1954. From 1954 to 1961, the territory was administered by a citizens' council called the Varishta Panchayat of Free Dadra and Nagar Haveli. In 1961, it was made a union territory following its merger with the Union of India. So this is something about the history of the two union territories, which you need to know. So Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu have been merged into a single union territory. The capital of the merged union territory will be Daman. So Daman will be the capital of the merged union territory. So according to the Act, on and from the appointed date, so the appointed date is 26 January 2020. So there shall be allocated two Lok Sabha seats, two seats to the Union Territory of Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu in the House of the People. So there will be two seats for this Union Territory in the Lok Sabha. The Bombay High Court shall exercise its jurisdiction over the Union Territory of Dadra, Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu. And with the merger of Daman and Diu and Dadra, Nagar Haveli, the number of union territories have come down to 8. So today we have 28 states and 8 union territories. Earlier we used to have 29 states and 7 union territories. Jammu and Kashmir was split into 2 union territories. Then it became 28 states and 9 union territories. Again, with the merger of two union territories into single union territory, we now have 28 states and 8 union territories. So this is something which you need to remember. So this is about the merger. The merger has taken place following the passage of a bill by the parliament, and the appointed date was 26 January 2020. Moving on to the next topic, this is very important for your examination. This topic is called Monetary Policy Committee. So what is the Monetary Policy Committee? What is the function of the Monetary Policy Committee? And what is the reason why it is in the news? So it is often in the news. So they are often in the news. Once in every 2 months they will be in the news. So very recently, so I am updating the developments that have taken place with respect to the monetary policy of the government of India, sorry, of the Reserve Bank of India. So the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee, led by Governor Shaktikanta Das, kept the repo rate unchanged at a 2-decade low of 4%. So they have decided not to change the key rates at the latest meeting. So they have decided to keep one key policy rate, that is repo rate, at 4%. So please go through the definitions of the key rates, especially the repo rate, reverse repo rate, marginal standing facility rate, and the bank rate. So recently the Monetary Policy Committee has met and they have decided not to make any changes to the key rates. All the MPC members unanimously voted for keeping the repo rate unchanged while maintaining its accommodative stance. So it is adopting an accommodative stance. Accommodative stance means a pro-growth stance. So there are two stances that are taken by the Monetary Policy Committee. One is the neutral stance and the accommodative stance. When the RBI adopts the accommodative stance, it actually favors a higher growth rate of the economy. So monetary policy. So in this context, we must know what is monetary policy and what is the Monetary Policy Committee. So this is a topic in economics, but I'm briefly dealing with this issue as far as current affairs is concerned. I'll be telling you the key rates that are prevailing now. So monetary policy refers to the policy of the central bank with regard to the monetary instruments, the use of monetary instruments under its control to achieve the goals specified in the act. So monetary policy refers to the policy of the central bank. So it is the policy of the central bank with regard to the use of monetary instruments under its control to achieve the goals of specified in the act. So there are three components to the monetary policy. Monetary policy is the policy of the central bank, and it involves the use of monetary policy instruments or monetary instruments for what? To achieve the goals that are specified in the act. What is this act? That is the RBI Act of 1934. The Reserve Bank of India, so the Central Bank of India in India, Central Bank in India is the Reserve Bank. So the Reserve Bank of India is vested with the responsibility of conducting monetary policy. This responsibility is explicitly mandated under the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. So the RBI is responsible for the monetary policy, and this is explicitly stated in the RBI Act of 1934. The primary objective of the monetary policy is to maintain price stability. So this is very important. It can be asked in the examination. The primary objective of the Monetary Policy Committee is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth. So it should always keep in mind the objectives of growth, but at the same time, the primary objective is, however, to maintain price stability. So price stability is a necessary precondition for sustainable growth. So in May 2016, an important development has taken place. So on the recommendations of the Urjit Patel Committee, the RBI Act has been amended. The RBI Act was amended to provide a statutory basis for the implementation of the flexible inflation targeting framework. So RBI Act was amended to provide a statutory basis for the implementation of the flexible inflation targeting framework. So what is the amendment? So the amended act act says, the amended act also provides for the inflation target to be set by the Government of India in consultation with the Reserve Bank once in every 5 years. So the inflation target for the country will be set by the Government of India in consultation with the RBI once in every 5 years. Accordingly, the government has notified in the official gazette 4% CPI inflation as the target for the period August 5th, 2016 to March 31st, 2021. So accordingly, the government has fixed the the CPI target, consumer price inflation or index target, some CPI inflation target at 4%, and there is a tolerance limit for this. So upper tolerance limit is plus 2%, that is 6%, and the lower tolerance limit is minus 2%, that is 2%. So the RBI has kept the target of inflation at 4%. There are upper tolerance and lower tolerance limits. Lower tolerance limit is 2% and the upper tolerance limit is 6%. So the act was amended, as I have told you, to create what is called the Monetary Policy Committee. So the Monetary Policy Committee comprises of 6 members. So this is very important. So the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI has 6 members. It is headed by the Governor of RBI, and it has 2 more members from the RBI. 3 members of the Monetary Policy Committee are appointed by the Government of India. So it comprises of 6 members. Chairperson of the Monetary Policy Committee is the Governor of the RBI. It also includes the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India in charge of monetary policy, and there is one officer of the RBI to be nominated by the Central Board. Then there are 3 more members who are appointed by the government. So we must know the key rates now. So as on August, so today is August 9, 2020. So August 9, 2020. These are the prevailing rates. It will keep on changing. So please note that these are not permanent. So as on August 2020, these are the rates. So 4% repo rate. Reverse repo is 3.35%. Marginal standing facility is 4.25%, and the bank rate is 4.25%. So 4.25% is the bank rate. Marginal standing facility rate is also 4.25%. Repo and reverse repo are very important. Reverse repo rate is 3.35 and repo rate is 4%. Moving on to the next topic for today's class. So this is a very important topic for this year's prelims examination as well as the mains examination. So the government of India has finally created the post of the Chief of Defence Staff, or the Office of the Chief of Defence Staff. So this was a much needed reform in the defence sector. Following the Kargil war, a number of committees have made a recommendation for creating the post of the Chief of Defence Staff, and this was announced by the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister, in his Independence Day speech 2019, has announced the creation of the post of the Chief of Defence Staff. And this was later approved by the cabinet, and it has been created. General Bipin Rawat was made the first Chief of Defence Staff. But what do you mean by the Chief of Defence Staff, and what are the functions of the Chief of Defence Staff? That is mentioned here. So in a landmark decision with a tremendous reform in higher defence management in the country, the Union Cabinet, chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has approved the creation of, or has approved to create the post of Chief of Defence Staff in the rank of a 4-star general with salary and perquisites equivalent to a service chief. So the government has decided to create this post of Chief of Defence Staff, and his rank will be a 4-star general, and his salary and perquisites will be similar to that of a service chief. The Chief of Defence Staff will head the Department of Military Affairs, to be created within the Ministry of Defence, and function as its secretary. This is very important. Chief of Defence Staff will be the head of the Department of Military Affairs, which will be created under the Ministry of Defence, and he will act as its secretary. So very important. So he will be the head of the Department of Military Affairs. The department, the recommendation for the CDS has been made first after the Kargil war. It argued that this post will create better coordination between the 3 services. The recommendation for the CDS, that is the Chief of Defence Staff, has been made for the first time after the Kargil war. So it was noticed that there was lack of proper coordination between the 3 services, and several committees have actually, I think Naresh Chandra committee, if I am not wrong, has recommended the creation of the Chief of Defence Staff for better coordination of the 3 services. The following areas will be dealt by the Department of Military Affairs, headed by the CDS. So these are the following areas. So the armed forces of the Union, namely the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, comprising of the Army headquarters, Navy headquarters, Air Force headquarters, and Defense Staff headquarters. So the following areas will be dealt by the Department of Military Affairs. So armed forces of Army, Navy, and Air Force. Integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, comprising Army, Navy, as well as the Air Force headquarters and the Defense Staff headquarters. Then the Territorial Army. Territorial Army is not the regular army, but who are trained to fight for the country when needed. Works relating to the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Procurement exclusive to the services except capital acquisitions as per prevalent rules and procedures. The Department of Military Affairs will also deal with the procurement exclusive to the services except capital acquisitions as per prevalent rules and procedures. Apart from the above, the mandate of the Department of Military Affairs will also include, it also includes the following areas: promoting jointness in procurement, training, and staffing for the services through joint planning and integration of their requirements. So, promoting jointness in procurement, training, and staffing for the services through joint planning and integration of their requirements. Facilitation of restructuring of military commands for optimal utilization of resources by bringing about jointness in operations, including through establishment of joint theater commands, and promotion of indigenous equipment by the services. Promoting use of indigenous equipment by the services. So this is taken out from the PIB. So just for your information, I have added all this. So you must know that the post of the Chief of Defence Staff has been created. The Chief of Defence Staff acts as the head of the Department of Military Affairs. He will be the principal advisor of the Defence Minister on various matters relating to the military affairs. Um, he will also serve as the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff's Committee. He will act as the principal advisor to the Raksha Mantra, that is Defense Minister, on all matters. The three chiefs will continue to advise the Raksha Mantri on matters exclusively concerning their respective services. So all the three chiefs have their own forte. They will advise the Defense Minister on matters exclusively concerning to their services. CDS will not exercise any military command, so he will not be exercising any military command, including over the three services chiefs, so as to able to be provide impartial advice to the political leadership. So he will not have any military command, and he will be dealing an administrative post, advisory role. He will be providing advice to the political leadership. So days after the government announced the creation of the Chief of Defence Staff post, retiring Army Chief General Bipin Rawat was on December 30th appointed the first Tri-Service Chief with effect from December 31st, 2019. So with effect from December 31st, 2019, he was made the Tri-Services Chief. So this is about the Chief of Defence Staff. Then we will move on to an index that is in the news, which is also very important for your exam. So this topic falls under indexes. So I have already mentioned some indexes in the previous lectures. So indexes, parameters, then ranking, best ranking country or state. So this is a national index. Then worst ranking if you possible. So releasing organization also is very important. Okay, so let us talk about an index that has been released by the Ministry of Power and Renewable Energy. So the State Rooftop Solar Attractiveness Index. So this SARAL stands for State Rooftop Solar Attractive Index. Was launched by the Minister for State of Power and New and Renewable Energy in 2019. So this is an index which was launched in 2019. That is the reason why it is important for this year's exam. So this is an index which was launched in 2019 by the Ministry of Power and New and Renewable Energy. The index aims to incentivize rooftop solar energy by creating healthy competition among states. So rooftop solar energy includes installing solar panels over commercial, industrial, and other establishments. So this has significant potential in our country. So India has been encouraging solar energy on a large scale. We have also set a very ambitious target, and we are encouraging installation of rooftop solar systems. As part of this, the SARAL index has been created to create healthy competition among states. The ministry encourages all the states to adopt the best practices followed by the top ranking states. So, who ranks first in the index? So, the Karnataka state. The Karnataka has topped the SARAL index, very important, which evaluates the Indian states on the basis of their attractiveness for rooftop development. Other states that follow Karnataka, Telangana, Gujarat, and Andhra Pradesh. So Karnataka ranks first in the SARAL index. This is a small point that you need to remember. State rooftop solar attractiveness index. State rooftop solar attractiveness index. So the SARAL index has been jointly developed by the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, ASSOCHAM, and Ernst and Young. So it is a collaborative effort of 4 organizations, and there are 5 parameters on the basis of which it is created. So robustness of policy framework, implementation environment, investment climate, consumer experience, and business ecosystem. So these are the 5 parameters on the basis of which this index is formulated. I don't think they'll ask you about the parameters used for formulating the SARAL index, but they may ask you which state ranks first in this index. The state that ranks first in this index is Karnataka, followed by Telangana, Gujarat, and Andhra Pradesh. Then we will move on to the next topic. So the next topic is an event which was hosted by India in September 2019. This is very important. So international summits and location. This is a commonly asked question in the civil services examination, especially the prelims examination. So all important international events are very useful. All important international events are very useful for the exam. So here we are talking about Conference of Parties number 14 to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So I think you all might have heard about the historic Earth Summit. Earth Summit was held in 1992, and it resulted in the adoption of 3 historic conventions. So 3 conventions were adopted at the Earth Summit. One convention is the most famous convention, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There is another convention on Biodiversity. The third convention to be adopted at the Earth Summit is United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So all these 3 are very, very important for your exam. So, and the progress that is made in realizing the goals that have been established under the 3 conventions will be constantly monitored at various events which are called Conference of Parties. So, for example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has set a goal of restricting the rise in the global temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, in pursuit of that objective, the countries meet regularly and discuss whether we are on track in realizing that objective or not. So, similarly, every convention will have countries which have signed and ratified the convention, and the countries that have signed and ratified the convention are called parties. So parties are nothing but countries which have signed a particular convention, and these meet either regularly or occasionally, and whenever they meet, it is called Conference of Parties. So we have several Conference of Parties that are held. For example, the most famous Conference of Parties is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the latest Conference of Parties to this convention was held in Madrid, COP number 25. What does this indicate? So all parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change are called Conference of Parties. They have met for the 25th time, and they have met in Madrid. Similarly, we have this convention called the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So this is a convention which was adopted to deal with the problem of desertification, that is the conversion of productive land into a wasteland because of human induced factors, and some natural factors. So there are parties which have signed this convention and they have met for the 14th time. And COP14 has held in 2019 and it was held in New Delhi. So Delhi hosted a conference of parties number 14. This is very important for your examination. So let me read what I have written here. So the 14th Conference of Parties of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification was held in September 2019 in New Delhi. It ended up with the 196 countries and the European Union. So it not just includes countries but also others. So 196 countries and the European Union have adopted what is called the New Delhi Declaration. At the summit, this is very important. So at the summit, India announced that it will raise its ambition of the total area that will be restored from its land degradation status from 21 million hectares to 26 million hectares between now and 2030. This is very important. So India has pledged to restore, this is very important, so to restore 26 million hectares of land that has been degraded by 2030. So by 2030, India will be restoring as much as 26 million hectares of land. Earlier, we have set a target of 21 million hectares, and now we have increased the target to 26 million hectares. So what are these targets? So there is a specific challenge that was adopted earlier. So you must know what is land degradation. Land degradation is defined as the temporary or permanent decline in the productive capacity of the land and the diminution of the productive potential, including its major land uses and its value as an economic resource. So degradation of land, that is conversion of a productive land into an unproductive or a wasteland, is called land degradation. So in order to combat land degradation, we have adopted this convention to combat desertification. So it is the Bonn challenge. So you must remember this challenge. So Bonn challenge. What is the Bonn challenge? So Bonn is a place in Germany. So the Bonn challenge is a global effort to bring 150 million hectares of the world's deforested and degraded land into restoration by 2020 and 350 million hectares by 2030. It was launched in 2011 by the government of Germany and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and later endorsed and extended by the New York Declaration on Forests at the 2014 summit. So this challenge, this is a simple challenge but very important for your exam. So Bonn challenge is a global effort to bring 150 million hectares of degraded land, world's deforested and degraded land, into restoration by 2020. So this challenge aims at restoring 150 million hectares of land by 2020, and by 2030, 350 million hectares must be restored. This challenge was adopted in the year 2011 by IUCN and the government of Germany, and it was later extended by the New York Declaration on Forests. Very important for your examination. So India has also accepted the Bonn challenge in 2015. India initially set the target of 13 million hectares to be restored by 2020 and 21 million hectares to be restored by 2030. So this is a very ambitious target that India has set, but now it has become far more ambitious. So we have increased the target from 21 million hectares to 26 million hectares by 2020. This is something which is important, you need to know. So at the United Nations Conference of the Parties, COP 2015 in Paris, that is the to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So India joined the voluntary Bonn challenge and pledged to restore 13 million hectares of degraded and deforested land by 2020 and an additional 8 million hectares by 2030. So India's pledge was one of the largest in Asia. So India has set itself an ambitious target of restoring 26 million hectares. Initially it was 21, now we have increased it to 26. Then there is one more declaration which we have come across just now, that is the New York Declaration on Forests. So what is the New York Declaration on Forests? The New York Declaration on Forests is a voluntary and non-binding international declaration. So this is something important. It is voluntary and it is non-binding. So it is not binding on the members and it is voluntary. So they have not been forced to adopt this declaration. They have voluntarily adopted this declaration. So it is a voluntary and non-binding international declaration to take action to halt global deforestation. So this is something which has to do with deforestation. This declaration, which was adopted in 2014 United Nations Climate Action Summit, aims at controlling deforestation. In September 2019, the list of New York Declaration on Forest supporters has grown to include 200 endorsers, including national governments, subnational governments, multinational companies, groups representing indigenous communities, and NGOs. These endorsers have committed to doing their part to achieve NYDF's 10 goals and follow its accompanying action agenda. So, what are the major goals? So, first of all, the declaration includes ambitious target to end natural forest loss by 2030. So, this is a point which you need to remember. The New York Declaration of Forest aims at stopping deforestation. That is, targets to end natural deforestation uh, by 2030 and to reduce deforestation by 50% by 2020. So, deforestation must be reduced to 50% by 2020 and it should be completely eliminated by 2030. That is what it says. In addition, the declaration calls for adoption of the bond challenge. So, in addition, the declaration calls for restoring 350 million hectares of degraded and deforested lands by 2030, supporting the private sector in eliminating deforestation from the supply chain of major agricultural communities by 2030, and providing financial support to reduce emissions related to deforestation and forest degradation. Achieving the New York Declaration on Forest goals could reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases by 4.8 to 8.8 billion metric tons every year, equivalent to the United States annual emissions. So, this is a very, very important point. So, if we achieve the target set under the New York Declaration on Forest, we can absorb significant amount of greenhouse gases by increasing the green cover. It is equivalent to the amount of emissions that the United States of America releases. They account for nearly 13% of the global emissions, and every country is striving forward to achieve its target. So you have three aspects here. One, the COP14. COP14 was held in New Delhi. We must know about the bond challenge. So these are small topics, can be asked only for the prelims examination. You must know the essential objective of the bond challenge and the New York Declaration on Forest. You need not know anything more because I don't think it will be asked in the mains examination. So we will come to the last topic of today's class. The last topic for today's class is Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. So what is Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna? What are the various aspects of this particular award? So the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna is the highest sporting honor of the Republic of India. So it is the highest award in India in the field of sports. It is named after Rajiv Gandhi, who served as the Prime Minister from 1984 to 1989. It is awarded annually by the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. So this is an award presented annually by the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. So you must remember that the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna is the highest award in the field of sports given by India. It is presented by the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports and is named after Rajiv Gandhi. Who are eligible to the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna? So there is a specific condition that must be fulfilled for a person to achieve or receive the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. The spectacular and most outstanding performance in the field of sports by a sports person over a period of 4 years. So the person eligible for the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna must have displayed significant performance in the field of sports over the past 4 years. So 4 years is the period that is taken into consideration for giving the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna, preceding the year during which the award will be given, which preceding the year during which is to be given, which will be considered for Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna Award for excellence in sports and games at the international level. So whoever performs exceptionally well over the past 4 years in various international events like the Olympics or the Cricket World Cup or major international events will be considered for the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. So you should not be confused. So those who perform well over 4 years, it is not just 1 year or in one event. So whoever has brought laurels to India over the past 4 years is considered for the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. So the latest recipients of the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna are Bajrang Punia and Deepa Malik. So these two persons are very important. A potential question for this year's examination. Who are the latest recipients of the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna? So the latest recipients of the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna are Bajrang Punia wrestling and Deepa Malik Paralympics. So this is about the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna. So this topic falls under awards and winners. So you must be thorough in this topic. So questions can be asked. So this is the class. So this is lecture 11. So if you have any doubts, so you can ask me questions. So you can call me at this number 767393990. So if you like the class, please like, comment, and subscribe. So please use this code RRUPSC. RRUPSC is the code. You can follow me on Telegram. You can message me on Telegram at this number, or you can follow my channel, Rajashekara Reddy. Rajashekara is a single word, Reddy, and UPSC. So 3 words. So you can follow me on this channel. So if you want the material, so the PDF is available on this channel. So please join this channel. Okay. So thank you so much and have a great day.